This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast, a podcast with a worldwide listenership that explores the broad world of preservation from every angle, from drones to mudlarking and everything in between. Now, let's get preserving. The story of the Green Book is critically important, and a story we absolutely felt we had to bring to our listeners. For preservationists, Green Book sites are also often vivid physical reminders of our past that are piled high with challenges for reuse. Elevating, interpreting, preserving, and retelling the story of this book and its impact on America makes for an ideal PreserveCast conversation. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. Today, we're thrilled to be talking with Candacy Taylor, who is an award-winning author, photographer, and cultural documentarian, and is also, of course, the author of Overground Railroad, The Green Book, and The Roots of Black Travel in America. And before we dive into that, which is just a fascinating topic and something near and dear to my heart and projects that we're working on here in Maryland, we love, as everybody who listens knows, to get to know our guests and a little bit about their background. So what's your story? Obviously, you have a real passion for history. And what was your background, your upbringing? What got you interested in all of this?
Yes, I started doing the Green Book research in about 2013, but before that, I have a master's degree in visual criticism and my undergraduate degree is in painting and drawing. So I've been an artist all my life. And I really didn't start writing until I went to grad school. My first book was called Counterculture. It was on the American Diner Waitress. And I was always interested in different subcultures, but also how race, class, and gender was kind of operating in modern society through the lens of these old neighborhoods, these old established, restaurants that had been around forever. And so I found myself in a lot of older communities. And I did a project on hair beauty shop culture with the Library of Congress. I interviewed hairstylists from all over the country, serving different ethnicities from Appalachian to African American to Orthodox Jewish communities, LGBTQ communities, just really, so I found myself in so many different pockets throughout America, and I've been doing this work for, at that time, at least over 13 years, and had been to so many different parts of America. But when I learned about the Green Book, and because I'm a Black woman and I'd been traveling so much throughout the United States, I was commissioned to do a book on Route 66. And I realized early in my research that half the counties on Route 66 were sundown towns, which meant they were all white communities and they were all white on purpose. I just thought, my God, how did Black people travel Route 66? And a series of questions led me to the Green Book. And I never knew such a thing had existed. This was about, like I said, 2013. I didn't realize at that time, very few, even historians and academia, knew that there was a Green Book. A man named Calvin Ramsey had a couple of articles out in the New York Times. He was doing early research on the Green Books. But it was still all very new and exciting. And that was, at that moment, I thought, this is my next book. This is my next project. And that's how I stumbled into it.
And I guess growing up, did you always have a fascination with history? Where did you, I don't know if you mentioned, where did you grow up?
Oh, I grew up I've lived so many places. I was born in Gary, Indiana, only lived there till I was about 4. And then we moved to Houston, Texas. And I was there till I was about 10. And growing up at that age in Houston with a single mom, was very, it was challenging in the way that I saw race. That was the first time I learned that I was Black. And it was really defining moment because my elementary school, I was being targeted, by my teachers, not even really the kids. So much, although my sister was called the N-word pretty much daily. And she was a teenager working in a pizza shop. But I was constantly being put in the B-level reading courses. My mother taught me how to read and write before I even went to kindergarten. So we had school every day. And even though she was a single, education was extremely important, and she knew I was smart and she knew I was well trained. But the school was holding me back into these kind of mid-level coursework, and no Black kids were in the A-level reading courses. And long story short, my mom called this teacher out, and the teacher started crying and basically admitted that was the case. And my mom pulled me out of that school, and we moved to Ohio. And I skipped from the 3rd grade to the 5th grade when I got to Ohio. So had I stayed in Texas, I probably wouldn't have been an author. I may have had a very different course of my life, had maybe taken a different course, because it was really the support of not just my family, but of the school system that really shaped, I think, and gave me opportunities, even though we didn't have money, that I could go to college and become whatever I wanted to be. So Texas really shaped my upbringing. And also it was the first place I saw a chain gang of Black men chained up in a field and I asked my mother, and we were in Texas, and I said, why are all these men chained up in a field? And she said, well, because they're prisoners. And I said, well, why are they all Black? And she couldn't answer that. She couldn't explain institutional racism to me. I was 7 at the time. But yeah, those early years really did, I guess that was the inquisitive child who just saw that racism was a factor and that this was wrong. That never left me. So yeah, those 2 things really followed me throughout my life. And then I lived in Ohio till I was a teenager and then moved away.
So before we jump into your book, and you mentioned sort of how you got into this and interest in the Green Book, but for people listening, we have listeners not only across the country but really even across the world. So what was the Green Book? When was it published? And then maybe we'll get into how they identified sites and things like that. But what was it? When was it published? What are the basics of it?
The Green Book was a travel guide that was published for Black people during the Jim Crow era. And it started publication in 1936 and stayed in publication through 1967. It did take a couple of years off during the war. And there's a couple of editions that we just don't have. We don't know if it was published in 65, for instance. But for the most part, it was an annually published travel guide. And it wasn't the only one, however. There were other Black traveler guides that were published, and the Green Book wasn't the first one. The first Black Traveler's Guide was Hackley and Harrison's in 1930, and it was only published for a year. And then there were no others until the Green Book, which was in 1936. But the Green Book was so popular because it was, first of all, it just was serving this incredible need that hadn't been, that no one else had a solution for. But it was also distributed by Esso gas stations. It had an incredibly innovative marketing system that got it out to people throughout the country. I can talk more about that later if you want. But the Green Book really was the longest running, and by 1962 there were over 2 million people using the Green Book. So it was clearly the most popular.
And so talk about the publishers and how did they identify these sites? I mean, now, we're so spoiled just with travel. Let's take race and ethnicity and everything out of it just for a second. Like, we're just spoiled with travel. Like, I even remember being a kid, your parents would get like the AAA book and they'd have to figure out like, oh, well, maybe this would be the right hotel or whatever. And now you just jump online and it's just, it's just second nature. But how on earth would you put together a book like this did they have to send people into the field? How did that work?
Yes. We are spoiled. And, Victor Green was the man who created the Green Book, and he was a postal worker, and he lived in Harlem, New York. And in 1935, when he was working on the Green Book, his first edition, there was a major riot here in Harlem. I live in Harlem. And he really did, again, he was solving an immediate problem within his community. The first editions of the Green Book were Harlem-based. We've never seen a 1936 copy. We do know it exists. But from what we can tell, it was only 10 pages, and it was more like a zine. It was more like a local, probably on, it wasn't professionally published. It was by 1940, he had found actual publishers that were using letterpress and using actual publishing equipment and marketing, and all of that came much later. But in the very beginning, it was very, it was just a roots-based, community-based guide that was necessary, because despite the fact that we think the Harlem Renaissance, that Harlem was this mecca of Black celebration of Black culture, and there were Black people who could just kind of, this place where they could be and feel, welcome. That wasn't really the case in Harlem. I mean, Harlem was still highly, there were large immigrant community here of, Irish and Italians. And for the most of the 30s, there were definitely, even 125th Street, which is a major thoroughfare, nearly half of all the businesses on 125th Street, Black people either couldn't go in, or there were rules about where they could be in certain theaters. You still needed a guide to navigate even your own neighborhood. So it started very small, and then it grew very quickly because, as I said, it was serving this critical need throughout the country. So by 1939, it was in every state east of the Mississippi River. And yes, the way that he did that, he did have people who, Green Book representatives, who would go out and go to these who were traveling, and they would report back and say, this is a place where you can go. Thankfully, I won't say it's a double-edged sword. I mean, the country was so segregated racially. That job wasn't as hard as you would think, because there were just so many pockets of Black communities, because they literally were not allowed to be in the white areas of town. So a lot of representatives would go to these Black areas of town. Now, also, Victor Green was a postal worker. So he was listed in the Postal Workers Union. And even within the postal workers system, it was segregated. So there was a Black postal workers union throughout the country. So he would connect with them and say, I know you can go on your beat in your town where there was only Black businesses and Black communities. And so they would bring the Green Books with them, or at least tell business owners that there is such a thing, and get them to solicit their participation. So it grew in a very organic way. Again, Victor Green had, I think, the reach of the Postal Service, which I think really helped facilitate the growth of the Green Book so quickly. But there were all these other factors working as well that he used, and it was an organic process. But when he finally did get the publisher that he wanted, and I cover this in the book, it made a big difference in the design and the style, and then it became a brand, and it just grew from there.
So was there anything created like this for other ethnic groups? Is this singular in its history? I'm guessing there must have been something like this for LGBTQ, but I don't know if it was at the same level. Did you look into that at all?
I looked into that a little bit. I mean, we do know that Victor Green had a Jewish friend who was traveling up north to the Borscht Belt, and he used a kosher guide to travel to even within upstate New York and within New York, where he felt more comfortable having this kosher guide. And so we do believe that Victor Green was influenced by him when he was starting the Green Book. He thought, this would be good for us, because he was, again, living in Harlem. His wife, Alma Duke Green, lived in Richmond, Virginia. So he was driving her home pretty regularly. And those trips, I'm sure were pretty harrowing. His brother-in-law was a musician, a really, very accomplished musician. And I'm sure within that world, there were always stories about how difficult it was to be a traveling Black musician, and to find services. So yes, there were kosher guides that helped Jewish communities. And there were LGBTQ guides that we know of in the 50s and 60s. I don't know of any in the 30s. And I know there was a scholar who was looking into that, and it would be interesting to know if he found anything that was earlier. But the Green Book, again, was so unique because it was a very critical time and place in terms of the second wave of the Great Migration was underway. There were so many, 1.5 million Black Southerners were fleeing racial terror in the South and heading north. There were a lot of Black people on the move at this time, whereas, again, with the other populations, whether they were Jewish or LGBT, it was still really much more about vacation and about access to doing things. But the Green Book was so critical because a lot of migrant families were using it. There were a lot of middle-class Black folks as well who wanted to take vacation, but it was also serving this other critical need. And there were lynchings in the South. There were real reasons why people needed to be on the run. And when you look at train travel, that wasn't pleasant for Black people either. And the idea of the car was such a symbol of freedom for all Americans, but even more so for Black Americans, because it shielded them from the segregated spaces of the streetcars and the humiliation of having to ride in a train and be covered in soot because the only cars you could sit in were the ones right behind the caboose. And, if you just had your car, you felt so much more free and just hopeful, about life. So the Green Book provided that as well.
I think that's a really important point because I think a lot of people think of it more as like a vacation guide almost, and I think that's an important piece there too about the Great Migration that I think is probably often overlooked, is that this wasn't just, it could, and it oftentimes was used for that, like you said, like leisure travel, but it was also about being able to safely get around as you're moving and migrating and things like that, which is makes it even more powerful. So you talk in the book about people who were brave enough to put themselves in the book, in the Green Book, that is. So do you have some examples of that? Like, obviously there are places run by African Americans, but then there's places run by Caucasians and others who were willing to be in the book. Are there examples of bravery that sort of stand out that impressed you or surprised you?
Yes. And this was a factor because, as you pointed out earlier, it was not, first of all, how did he find these places to participate? And again, finding Black business owners was part of the networking that he had access to. But getting white business owners to participate was very difficult. And we see that in definitely in other parts of the country. The East Coast, especially the Northeast, because the cities were so dense and there were more urban kind of cities, there were cities. They were just not these big rural expanses. And you'll see throughout the country, I've cataloged over 10,000 Green Book sites. And most of them are clustered in, cities, and some of the whole state of Michigan, really 90% of the Green Book sites are in Detroit. You were out of luck in most other parts of the state. And there would be tourist homes. There were these places that were like the first Airbnbs, right? Single, mostly widowed women would run these tourist homes, and they were just a home with a bed and a warm meal. Again, for people who were not, they were less expensive as well. So people maybe who were migrating would rely on tourist homes. But the expansiveness of how these places really provided, there were different tools in the Green Book that people could use given their circumstances. But when it got to the point where Victor Green wanted to bring in, if you were in the middle of North Dakota, where would you go? And he prints some of the letters of inquiries where he's trying to get people in these other states to participate. And he reprints the letters that have come back to him explaining why they can't do it. And it's, it's embarrassing, and it makes you cringe, because they're just like, well, we don't have, it would just be, a curiosity for Negroes to be in this area. And I don't want to take, I don't want to alienate the white customers. So, even though, we're not, they wouldn't say racist, but say, even though there's no prejudice here, we just don't feel comfortable, doing that. And I reprint some of these letters in my book. And so you can see him struggling. So yeah, it took courage for white folks, especially in the 40s and the 50s. Now, by the time the late 50s, after Brown versus Board of Education happens in 54, and most of America is getting a sense of like the tides are going to turn, whether some people want them to or not. They knew it was on the horizon. It was just a matter of when. And of course, 1964 is when the Civil Rights Act is passed, and it's, we have a law now stating that there has to be integration. But from that spot, you find a lot of the more larger, like Brooks Brothers and Macy's and the Waldorf Astoria and fancy, the Biltmore in Los Angeles and the Drake in Chicago, and these big, huge, hotels that were opulent are in the Green Book. And those are in the later editions and, the 60s. But places like Charlie's on the south end of Boston was in the Green Book earlier than that. And it was white, and a very white, historically difficult place for Black folks to live and be. This community has been notorious for racism, but Charlie's was there, and it literally was below the Porters Union. And Charlie, the man who ran it, was a Greek immigrant, and he really opened his doors to all kinds of people and didn't care what, the white locals who were opposed to it. He didn't care what they thought. People like Sammy Davis Jr. went to this place. A lot of Black musicians in Boston would go there after hours, after their gigs. And it became a real, a hot spot, but also it was truly integrated. And there are examples of that. And you can tell, especially in that community in Boston, that was a risk. And he was willing to offend whoever to do the right thing.
Well, that might be a good place to take a quick break and then come back. And, I think you mentioned doing this cataloging of sites, and maybe we can talk a little bit about the preservation of these sites and how we tell these stories and protect these stories in the future. And we'll do that right here on PreserveCast. This week's PreserveCast is sponsored by Historic Roofing. Historic Roofing is your old house specialist. They're a small, family-run company of master craftsmen providing clients with consultations and expertise in restoration, maintenance, and repair in the lost arts and crafts of slate, tile, and architectural metal roofing since 1990. Historic Roofing has saved many prominent buildings in the Washington metropolitan area. To learn more about Historic Roofing's many services, visit historicroofingcompany.com, or better yet, give us a call at 410-741-0572. They'd love to discuss the history of your building and what its history holds. This week's episode of PreserveCast is sponsored by Washington County, Maryland, a destination for your next staycation. The county is famous for the Antietam battlefield and Civil War sites and a place to experience the 50th anniversary of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park. Washington County is also home to trails for hiking and biking, canoeing, arts and culture, and many locally owned restaurants and vineyards. To learn more, head to visithagerstown.com. Maryland, open for historic gateways. Before we get back to the episode, we're pleased to offer our listeners a 10% off discount on all Oliver Pluff tees, toddies, cacaos, and coffees. Just use the code PreserveCast at checkout. That's PreserveCast, PreserveCast at checkout over at oliverpluff.com. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. Today, we're thrilled to continue our conversation with Candacy Taylor, and we're talking about her work documenting the Green Book and her work in writing a book called Overground Railroad, the Green Book, and the Roots of Black Travel in America. And before we took the break, we were talking about the history of the Green Book, how it all came about, her work in writing this book, sort of the bravery associated with the people who were willing to stick their necks out and be listed, and how this evolved over time. And you mentioned, and it might be interesting to talk about this, has there ever been this nationwide survey of sites? I know here in Maryland and other states, there's been sort of state level documentation, but you mentioned you documented quite a few of them. Talk to us about the preservation of these sites and what we know about them.
Right. That's, something I've been working on. I'm not pretty much every day since I started this work in 2013. When I first started this project, Wikipedia, and I'm not recommending Wikipedia as a source, just, reliable source, but, Wikipedia said we had 1,500 Green Book sites. And when I went to the Schomburg Center, I got a fellowship in 2016. They have the largest number of Green Books, and you can definitely use them as a trusted source. They have digitized all the Green Books that they have. They have the largest collection in the world. I believe they have 24 editions now. But when I started this project, they were not digitized. We only knew that there were most historians and educators had access to 2 Green Books. And that's why Wikipedia said there were 1,500. Now we find that there's 24 of them at least, and I've cataloged, like I said, over 10,000 sites compared to 1,500. So of those sites, yes, I have a huge database where, and I've traveled to over 5,000 of these sites to write the book and to do the exhibition. I really wanted to get a sense of the communities, the state of the communities now and what they were like then, and looking at those comparisons. But it's a tragic reality that, we've lost at least 80% of them are gone. And about 3 to 5% are still operating. So many were lost for many different reasons. A big factor was urban renewal. I would go on the road, I was scouting about 30 sites a day. I was trying to do as much as I could before I had to just sit down to write the book. And I would see that maybe 20 of these sites were gone. They were replaced by a freeway. And I saw that over and over again in pretty much every major city. And that was a huge factor. It really decimated Black communities. It was considered quote unquote progress at the time. And these freeways really just were placed in vulnerable communities and destroyed them. It was really the beginning of the end. So you have urban renewal happening in the 50s, 40s to 50s. You have redlining happening, right? So these Black folks were legally bound to be in particular areas. And then when integration happens, you see things are loosening up. Again, people are able to move around more, not only to go on vacation, but middle-class Black people could leave these segregated communities and live in suburbs. Not always, that's still a process. Redlining is still part of what we deal with in this country, but things were loosening up incredibly. And so what happened was a lot of Black people who could say never were allowed to go to the French Quarter, to go to the clubs and frequent those, establishments. When they could, they did. And they left these Green Book businesses that had been thriving because they literally had a captive audience. Black people couldn't go anywhere else. So when they could, they did. And the end result and the casualty of that was these sites. And so by the 60s into today, some had just been literally falling apart. They had just been abandoned for decades. They were still standing, but they had trees growing out of them, like the Hampton House in Miami, which has undergone like a $10 million renovation, and is featured in the One Night in Miami movie that was just released. But now it's beautiful. It's been restored back into its glory of this mid-century modern building. It's stunning. So we have examples of that, but most of them, we've lost.
Yeah, and we've seen it here in Maryland. I mean, I was telling you before we started the interview that we're working in a community in Hagerstown, Maryland, a neighborhood called the Jonathan Street community, and pretty much all the Green Book sites there have been demolished, and it has to do with redlining essentially, and changes in zoning. They basically removed any commercial zoning, so there was no way to kind of continue on Black entrepreneurism. So there's just all of these barriers, but it seems so critically important to document them, get them all into one place. Have this database of it all. Is there anything like that? Is there anything in the works, or is there anything that people can look for?
I have one, and believe me, so many people want my database. But it's like, no, you can't have it because it's proprietary. It's mine. It's taken me literally years to do. I'm about 95% done with it. I've done all of the green books, and there's a section in the end that has the vacation rentals, and then there's the international sites. So
what are you going to do with it? Or is it eventually going to be published?
Literally, I mean, I do have a map that I have completed with National Geographic. And so my Green Book sites are on that map. So yes, you can see them on this map, but I will never just give away my database because it's been too many years of work. Unless, there's and I don't even know. I mean, a major institution asked me if they could buy it off of me. And I said, you can't afford it because I can't, in good faith. I mean, I do, quote unquote, share a lot of things, but this is how I make a living. And it is the work that, I have done every day since 2013. So it is mine to do other projects with. I'm developing a mobile app. Like I said, I did this digital interactive map with National Geographic. But no, I'm not going to just hand it over to institutions who have staff who could make their own or come to me and pay me for it,
Right. Well, maybe that's a good place to kind of talk about what you're working on next. So you mentioned a mobile app. What's in the future for you?
The mobile app is basically we have the prototype completed, and I hope to have that out by early next year. And it doesn't just have Green Book sites, but it's also tracing everything from lynching sites to modern day mass incarcerations, statistical data, whether it's private and federal prisons. It also includes socioeconomic data sets that factor into why we have not really evolved into the country that we say we are or that we want to be. So it's tracing all of those layers of history, but also in real time, because you can curate your own experience, whether you want to see, Black-owned businesses today that you can frequent, or historic Green Book sites, or if you're driving across country, sundown towns are also part of this. So, it will pop up on your screen and say, oh, you've entered what was once a sundown town. So it really kind of gives you an example of how this, the layers of our history are still living with us. And also how much things have changed in some ways, whether these places are, they look so different. These neighborhoods look so different than they were. And gentrification is a real thing that's also incredibly destructive to Black communities, and we're losing our Green Book sites to that as well. So the mobile app will be a great tool for that, and that's how this, this history, like I don't want to sit on all this data and not share it, but I find different platforms that I think will make it more useful.
It's fascinating. We'll have to have you back once that's out, because that seems like a just a fantastic project to learn more about. So if people want to learn more about you or stay up to date about that and get updates when the app comes out, or you got a new book, or they want to pick up previous books or documentaries, where can they do all that? Where can they find you?
TaylorMadeCulture.com is my website. And if you go to the Overground Railroad tab, you'll find out more about that. There's also an exhibition that is, I'm the curator and content specialist for an exhibition with the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Service. It goes under the acronym of CITES. And that exhibition is at the National Civil Rights Museum right now, and it will be touring the United States through 2024. The next venue will be the Mosaic Templars Museum, which is in Little Rock, Arkansas. So that's something you can follow as well. But if you sign my guest book at the bottom of the Overground Railroad page on my website, I can give you updates, and I send them out maybe 3 or 4 times a year.
Fantastic. And before we go, the most difficult question we normally ask anyone who comes on this podcast, which is, what's your favorite historic place or site?
Oh, yeah, that is hard because they're like your children, right? I mean, I don't have children, but yes, I fall in love with sites and then they change every day. But can I name one that's not actually, does it have to still be standing?
No, it can be anything.
Okay. Well, I'd say for the Green Book, one of my favorite sites was Murray's Dude Ranch. And it was it was in the Green Book in the early in the 30s and up to the 60s, but it was a great, it was in Victorville, California. It was in the Mojave Desert, which is Southern California. And it was a dude ranch. It was a Negro dude ranch that all the stars would go there. Joe Louis, the boxer, and his entourage would be there. And Pearl Bailey bought it in the 50s. It was owned by a Black family, the Murrays. But it was one of the first places where Black and white children swam together in the country, in that part of the country. It was a real, it was very popular. It was on the cover of Ebony magazine. There was a big article in Life magazine about it. And it was a place where most Black folks just didn't realize they'd ever have access to a dude ranch. And the fact that it was in the Green Book, is very exciting. The fact that we can resurrect all these archival photos. And I actually have pieces that when you go out there now, there's nothing left. But at least it's just land. It hasn't been, turned into a mini mall or anything. Although there is encroaching development happening right across the street from it. So I don't know how much longer we're going to even just have that land. But I've been out there many times just digging around in the dirt, looking for any old artifacts. And we have found some old, springs from mattresses and little pieces of tile from bathrooms or kitchen tile, horseshoes, things like that. And they are on tour with the exhibition. So you can go and actually see some of these artifacts from Murray's Dude Ranch. So I'd say that's my favorite.
I love that. I don't think we've done 170 plus episodes. We've never had a dude ranch. And so that's that's a perfect one and a great way to end this conversation with such a unique site. It's just so fascinating to talk with you and so appreciate to have you join us and share some of your information. Encourage people to pick up the book. The link to purchase the book is in the show notes for this episode, as well as the link to your website, and I meant it. We need to have you back once the app is up. We'd love to talk about that.
Well, thank you. It's been such an honor, and I really appreciate the interview.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to PreserveCast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. This episode of PreserveCast is brought to you by Tolson's Chapel and School, a National Historic Landmark in Sharpsburg, Maryland. Built in 1866 by free and newly freed African Americans, the Methodist Chapel doubled as a Freedmen's Bureau school from 1868 to 1869, and the county-run Sharpsburg Colored School until 1899. To learn more about this fascinating story and unique heritage, please visit Tolson's Chapel at tolsonschapel.org. That's TOLSONSCHAPEL.org. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.